Hello and welcome. We're delighted to have you here today. My name's Ed Bridges, and in behalf of all of us on the staff of the archives, we welcome you to this regular third Thursday lecture in our series that's been going on for about 20 years now. I'm really so happy that it worked out that we were able to schedule Dr. Rob Riser for this month for two reasons. Well, one is that we can join him in celebrating a major landmark event in his career. This is the month of the official publication by the LSU Press of his really important work, is defying disfranchisement. He's got it right here. It's a series of major cases across the Southeast that shows how African Americans initiated a number of legal actions to block all of the disfranchisement provisions that were being implemented all across the South in the late 1800s and at the turn of the century. Of which, there's a major case in Alabama, Giles v. Harris. So this is a major, important new book in Southern history that's just being published. It represents years of work by Dr. Riser. It's being published officially this month, and we celebrate with him that significant achievement. At the same time, there's another book that's just come out. This is the book, The History of the Middle District of the Federal Court in Alabama. And I want to tell you that's going to be the main topic for his presentation today. I'd like to give you just a little bit of background about this book. In, I believe it was 1999, as the district court was preparing to move into the new annex, Chief Judge Harold Albritton decided that the court needed to do something to ensure that a sense of the court's heritage would be continued in the new annex, and he established a court historical committee that John Scott headed up. And so the committee undertook a number of efforts to do oral history interviews with attorneys and judges connected with the court, to gather material, court historical material, to do research on the history of the court. And so and to do exhibits with the opening of the new building. After that was done, and then after Judge Albritton retired as Chief Judge, Judge Fuller took over, and he continued the court committee. Oakley Melton took over as chairman of the committee, and one of the focus of the groups there was a recognition that in thinking about the history of this really interesting court, so much attention had been given to Judge Frank Johnson, and rightly so, because his decisions have been so important in Alabama and American history. But the court has a real interesting history back before Judge Johnson, and that maybe something needed to be done that would increase our awareness of this very interesting history. So the committee worked with Dr. Paul Pruitt at the University of Alabama, and Paul helped us identify then, at that time, a young graduate student who was interested in legal history, was working on this case of Giles v. Harris and Booker T. Washington and Thomas Good Jones, and was a natural fit for us. He had law training as well. And so Rob Riser also undertook to compile this history of the court. Rob is now assistant professor of history at the University of West Alabama. He is co-chairman of the Department of History and Social Sciences. He's done a program here before for us on the 1901 Constitution, Booker T. Washington, and Thomas Good Jones, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome him back today. Please join me in welcome. Oh, I'm sorry, one more thing. We're also honored. I look out and I see a distinguished panel of judges. We're honored here to have three judges from the district court: Judge Albritton, Judge Fuller, Judge Watkins, joined by their colleague from the 11th Circuit, Judge Dabino. We are honored to have you here today. Dr. Riser. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not a judge. No, and I have to say, I'm kind of awkward up here. I've never had so much wiring attached to me in my whole life. So if I look bulky or move funny, it's like, what's on my waist? Thank you, Dr. Bridges, and everyone here at the Archives for having me today. And thank you, Judge Albritton and other judges for having hired me to do this in the first place. I sent an email to Judge Albritton recently, and I told him that, it was nice to be asked, but, it was especially nice because in the spring of 2005, I defended my dissertation and quit law school. So it was, no law school, no job, although I did get the West Alabama job right about the time I got this one. So I choose to think the two had one had something to do with the other. Dr. Bridges briefly alluded to the parameters of the project, and I'll tell you that when I was first given my instructions, I was going to do whatever they said. But when I first got my instructions, I was sort of surprised that I was to do a historical look at the Middle District that excluded Frank Johnson. That seems sort of counterintuitive. But as I got into it, I actually began to see the value of doing such a thing, and it's simply because Judge Johnson has gotten so much historical attention, he becomes in a way a sun that sucks up all the light that might be shown on his predecessors on the bench, and they are quite an interesting lot. It's not a really large group, but they're all very interesting, and what you start to see over time, you see some continuities, you see some similarities across time between the judges, and it's just a real interesting thing to look at. The best example of sort of the continuities that you can find is if you look at the career of Charles Brents Kennemer. Has anyone heard of, I'll ask you this with every judge, has anyone heard of Charles Kennemer? No. I see one hand, there you go. One of the stories that's always told about Judge Johnson is that when he took the bench, it was sort of a surprise because he's, this North Alabama Republican, and they moved him down to Montgomery to sit on the district bench. But that's not particularly unusual because Charles Brents Kennemer is a North Alabama Republican who's sent down here by a Republican president to sit on the bench here in the middle of the Black Belt. And two, if you look at some of the decisions that Kennemer had, some of the more famous ones, he is seeing the precursors to the famous civil rights cases that Judge Johnson himself would hear later in the 1950s and beyond. And again, it can be easy to get the impression or the misimpression, that nothing happens before Johnson gets there. And again, Kennemer is a perfect example of how that is not so. First 150 years of the institution is essentially what we're looking at in this project. You do see a distinct evolution of the institution, and until the late 20th century, the thing, I don't know if it's the most interesting thing, but maybe one of the most interesting things to understand is that until the mid to late 20th century, the United States District Courts are the most prominent outposts of the federal government here in Alabama. There were, you may have heard of post office Republicans, but you also have, but those are not as prominent, certainly not as important or powerful as the judges who were installed at the various courthouses. For most of the court's history, we're calling this, I forget the exact title, but refer to it as the United States Court for the Middle District of Alabama. The judge for that court, and there's always just one judge, is also the judge for the Northern District and the Southern District. So for much of its history, it covers the whole state. And there's one judge. How many judges on just the Middle District today, Judge Albritton? And about the same number on the other two? So now there's about 15, and up until the middle of the 20th century, there's never more than one or two of these U.S. district judges at a time in the state. Now that is made up for, there would be, Supreme Court justices would have come here riding on circuit. Once they created the United States Courts of Appeals, you could bring in the Fifth Circuit justice up through the 70s, but that is not that common. And so not only is the judge a hugely prominent position, it's very singular, right? So it's going to be a very highest sought after thing. The first judge that we look at, he's actually not a judge for the District of Alabama. His name is Harry Toolman. He is the judge for the Tombigbee District of the Mississippi Territory. For those of you who look at the collection later, and we're actually giving that book away for free, so if you make sure you want to get one of those at the end, you'll find he's represented by no case. I mean, he did hear important cases, and he's certainly involved in important legal actions that you'll read about in the book. But he is, not only is he the most prominent federal official in Alabama, he is the federal government down here in what was called the Old Southwest and then called the Mississippi Territory. It's empty, it's big, and it's sort of scary. And what we use for him is a letter that he wrote to Secretary of State James Madison. What Harry Toolman may be most famous for is, does someone want to guess? He's the man who arraigned Vice President Aaron Burr for treason, right? After he was captured with his ill-fated plot to set up a rival republic down here in the Old Southwest. And you get a flavor of just how isolated and remote things are when you read that letter between Toolman and Madison. It's all speculation, you know, and it's clear. You get the clear impression it's just random people wandering through the wilderness almost, and somebody happens to bump into somebody else and happens to find a letter written in German that seems to suggest some sort of complicity in Aaron Burr's plot. But again, the main point is just how isolated everything is. But again, just how important that U.S. district judge is, right? There would have been a capital, there would have been a territorial governor, but the highest-ranking federal official anybody's going to have to ever deal with really is that U.S. district judge. After statehood comes, the district judgeship for Alabama is the most delicious political plum that anybody can see anywhere in sight. State office was nice. You know, it'd be nice to be a governor or something, and people did, you know, they were quite aggressive in seeking seats in Congress or in the United States Senate. But that federal district judgeship, that's the one you really want to get. We all know that judges have life tenure. We all know that they're not going to reduce your salary even if you retire, which it makes it a pretty good gig, I suppose, even today. But back then, it's not just a good gig, it's rare, right? There aren't very many judgeships, There aren't many people who could even aspire to such a thing. And it's the only such job that's going to exist in the whole state. So anytime the district judgeship opens up, it is a hotly contested thing. It'll be a full-fledged campaign. It's not, there are people who will advocate for a particular nominee for a judgeship today, but this is not the same thing. And it's also a different political class will be jockeying for these judgeships than you usually see happening today. Almost all of the early judges, in fact, I think just off the top of my head, I think only 3 of the judges looked at in this period are not very high-ranking politicians. And by high-ranking politician, what do I mean? I mean, you've been the governor of the state. There are 2 governors will sit as the district judge in the middle district. There will be 1 United States senator. There will be 2 congressmen. I mean, this is a choice political plum. If you're a politician, you want to get this job. Charles Tate, the first judge after statehood, so he is actually the first judge for Alabama. He is a former United States senator from Georgia. And one of the funny things, one of the funny stories you'll see in the book, or if you think about it after you've read it, is Tate is seen as one of the candidates of the Georgia faction. And what has happened is U.S. Senator Bibb from Georgia has moved into the territory of Alabama, and he intends to run it as his own fiefdom. And then you have another U.S. Senator from Georgia who also wants to populate the state, the new state, and run it as his own personal fiefdom. And so you'll see this contest between both of these factions, both of whom are deeply connected to Georgia. And I just love that one of them accuses the other of being the Georgia faction. It's like the pot calling the kettle black. But you'll have this sort of a high-level contest, all right? It's unusual, the level of the people, at least in the political world, that will be seeking it. The second one is also from Georgia. His name is William Crawford. He is not a United States senator, although there is a United States senator by the same name. And I think he was the vice president maybe under James Monroe, but his name is also William Crawford. And so Senator William Crawford of Georgia will be trying to have or be involved in the eventual appointment of William Crawford of Georgia as the second judge for the United States District Court. And then Crawford will be succeeded by John Gale, another former Alabama governor. Still haven't had one born in Alabama. That won't happen until the 20th century. Reconstruction, skipped over the Civil War period here because there are two judges in the court during the Civil War period. The judge at secession, his name is William Giles Jones. He only holds the seat for a couple of years before the state secedes, and so the Confederacy would have declared this their court. There is a judge appointed. President Lincoln appointed a judge named Lane to the office during the Civil War. Lane never actually heard a case. He spent most of the war in exile in Kentucky complaining. All right, now Reconstruction will bring outsiders, and I need to be careful saying outsiders. They've all been outsiders up until this point. But the thing they have in common, Tate, Crawford, Gale, they are all, though they've come from outside the state to this new territory and then state of Alabama, they are all clearly part of the state's legal culture. They have invented it, all right? So to that extent, they are of the place. Reconstruction will bring first Judge Richard Bastide from New York. He is, my favorite quote about him comes from my friend Mike Fitzgerald. He was, quote, the most corrupt public official in the entire state of Alabama. And Reconstruction also brings Judge Bruce, who is every bit as sedate and clean and calm and low-key as Bastide was colorful and corrupt. My favorite Bastide, actually I have two favorite Richard Bastide incidents. The first is maybe well known to students of Reconstruction. It's when the U.S. Attorney in Mobile decided to assassinate him. No? The U.S. Attorney in Mobile, who is, he may have been the most corrupt man in Alabama if it were not for the judge who was more corrupt than he. And the pot called the kettle black from the bench, and revenge must be had. And so the U.S. Attorney shot the judge in the street of Mobile. He survived and went on to continue his rather corrupt and colorful tenure on the bench. No, the favorite Bastide incident, and I'm going to forget because I don't have the book with me at hand, the title of the case. But what happened is during the Civil War, you can't sell Southern cotton openly in the international market. You know, it's embargoed, and the Union has, there's a naval blockade. You can't really get the stuff out of here. So the stuff is hoarded for the duration of the war. It is illegal to sort of trade in this confiscated Southern cotton, but people did it anyway, including the judge and staff of the United States District Court for the Middle and Southern and Northern Districts of Alabama. And there's a case comes before the court, and they've worked out this delightful scheme, and they'll send out the U.S. Marshals, and the Marshals will seize the cotton, and then they'll sell the cotton, and then they sort of have a sliding scale of how much they're all going to get paid for it. And what they're saying is they're being paid for their work, this quote unquote. And so they have this sliding scale. You know, the marshal will get X percent, and then the clerk of the court will get X percent. The judge doesn't actually officially get a percent, but somehow he's getting his cut too, because then when you look at it, the marshal may be allocated 50% of the proceeds, but then he has to pay another 10% kickback to the clerk, and it's a huge mess. So they do this, and the man whose cotton is taken appeals his case to the Supreme Court and goes all the way to the Supreme Court. He wins, so he's supposed to have his cotton returned, right? No, because they have sold the illegally confiscated cotton. And so the best thing that Bastide ever did was when he explained to the United States Supreme Court that, well, the cotton is gone and the proceeds have been, divvied up. So, we can't give the man anything back. And the United States Supreme Court actually had to tell him, no, you will give the man the money that these people got and you got, for selling the man's cotton. So he is clearly the most colorful, clearly the most corrupt, biggest wheeler dealer that ever sat on the bench. Mercifully, he is exceptional. All right, there's no evidence of anything like that happening before Bastide or since, and I think everyone would be relieved about that. John Bruce followed Richard Bastide on the bench. Bruce, he is, as I said before, he's quiet, he's unassuming. He is just the thing the state needed. Had Bastide stayed on the bench in Alabama for too much longer, he really could have. Reconstruction is a very tumultuous time. It is every bit as violent and terrifying for everyone involved as had been the Civil War that preceded it. It's as much of a war as the Civil War had been, and Bastide is only stirring the pot. And the fact that he is a federal official in now defeated former Confederate Alabama, right? See, if people would have looked suspiciously upon the idea of a federal official down here in the state, remember, and they're all by themselves. It's the judge, he has a clerk, he has a couple of U.S. Marshals. He is it for the federal government here in Alabama. So that can be a precarious position in any situation, right? You're clearly outnumbered. But Bastide is only irritating people further, right? So you have a population that's primed to explode, and Bastide is only stirring the pot. That is why it is so important that John Bruce was put on the bench, right? Because he will stabilize the bar, he'll stabilize sort of the political whirlwind that would necessarily surround the United States District Court, and he probably was the best thing that the court ever saw, right? Just in terms of that he was able to cool things off. Now, Bruce is succeeded by my favorite of these judges, Thomas Good Jones, and I'm going to save Jones for the end so that I can tell you about the judge that followed Jones, who will be the first native Alabamian to sit on the U.S. District Court bench here in Montgomery. His name is Henry Delmar Clayton, Jr. He's a congressman from here in the Black Belt. He is not most famous for his time as U.S. District Judge. I was teaching U.S. History 2 this spring, and my classes were not fascinated for me to tell them all about Henry Delmar Clayton and his role in the Wilson administration, but I'm sure you will be. In the 19-teens, actually for much of the first half of the 20th century, Alabama is unusually well placed in Washington, right? We owe this building in part to the incredible political connections or the political power that the state enjoyed at the national level. William, you have two senators, Bankhead. You have a Speaker of the House, Bankhead. But you have Oscar Underwood from Birmingham, who's an incredibly prominent member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And Henry Delmar Clayton is no slouch. Right? He will be one of the favorite deputies of Woodrow Wilson in his administration. You may have heard from U.S. History 2, someone made you learn about the United States, the Clayton Antitrust Act, for example. Clayton, though, as prominent as he was in Washington and powerful, he wanted to be a judge. And so what he does is really from a very early stage in the Wilson administration, he is campaigning hard from the get-go for a seat on the United States Supreme Court. And then a seat opens up, and he's like, yay, you know. Goes to Woodrow Wilson. He campaigns very hard for the seat, and I'm sure he was shocked and stunned when Louis Brandeis beat him out for it, all right? So, you know. So he's up against Louis Brandeis. He loses, not entirely surprising because it's, you know, Louis Brandeis. But it's not all for naught because when Thomas Jones suddenly died in 1914, Woodrow Wilson didn't hesitate. And so he installs Congressman Clayton here on the bench. Again, Clayton is the first Alabamian to hear the case. And while he does hear some interesting cases here in Montgomery and in Birmingham, he had Middle and Northern. By then, they have separated the Southern off. I should have said that by the end of the 19th century, the Southern District in Mobile has been separated. So it's now the Middle and Northern are all that's left together by the time Clayton takes the bench. Clayton is most famous, or should be most famous, for the Abrams case. So anybody, I suspect there's a whole bunch of law school folks in here. Abrams case, or maybe if you're familiar with Richard Polenberg's book, Fighting Face, you might not have been aware that the judge who heard that case out of New York City, out of the Southern District of New York, is actually Henry Delmar Clayton from the Middle District of Alabama, who had been shipped up to New York to clear the docket. He was famous as a docket clearer. So he ran a tight ship here in Montgomery, and then they would farm him out around the country to run other people's ships. In the early years of the court, well, I suppose for any judge, it's maybe the most fun that can be had is to be not necessarily be the first guy that has to deal with a new federal statute or a new Supreme Court precedent, but Well, what we know from, say, William Baldwin's flush times in Alabama and Mississippi is that the heyday of a bar are the first days of a bar. And so the first judges here in the district, first Tom Bigby district and then is the District of Alabama, they get to help create a local bar, right? They are the ones that get to create, essentially back in the days when there was such a thing recognized as a federal common law, they're the ones that get to help establish it in their jurisdictions, all right? It's not that it makes them more powerful than they are now or less powerful, but it would have been fun because they get to be present at the creation. In those earliest years, because they are so isolated, because they are so far from Washington, literally, what they get to do is they get to be the ones to show everybody how we're going to adapt federal law to the conditions here in the state. And so it's interesting to look in the decisions, not just the ones I picked here. We could have picked several others for this. You get to watch how they adapt. And there's always a question. It's not a question of will they follow the federal law. They always do. Or will they obey the precedent, because they always do. But it's a question of how exactly will it be applied to conditions here on the ground. And this is especially interesting when you know their own political backgrounds, when you know their particular political opinions. So it's interesting to see how they do this. Good example, when you look at someone's background and then try to figure out how they're going to do this. It happens with John Gale. What had happened in the case that's in the book is the Geneseo case. It has to do with navigable waterways, which is not, I'm not going to try to tell you that it's particularly sexy. It's not. But federal courts have admiralty jurisdiction. States do not get to, control admiralty in international waters. Only the federal judges can do that. What had happened is in this case, it was a question of it's navigable water, but it's not international waters. And in fact, it's not even the sea. It's navigable rivers. What applies there? And the Supreme Court, in a case out of the Northeast, had said, if it is accessible by the sea, in other words, if this thing is being served by, say, the Port of Mobile, and what we're talking about here is the Alabama River, then, ostensibly it would be federal admiralty jurisdiction. And so what happens is that the case comes up down here in Alabama, and you have a steamboat will plow through, I think it's a flat bottom sort of raft that's being floated down the river. Doesn't seem sexy, I know, but remember in this day and age, this is the Jacksonian era. This is the 1830s and 40s. Steamboats are new. They're scary. They are reshaping the entire country. They're opening up the interior. The main reason is because if you're in a steamboat, you can defeat the current. It's like it's like the railroad lets you defeat the seasons, a steamboat will let you defeat the current. So whereas once upon a time to get your goods to market, you just loaded them up on a raft and floated them down the river, what they would do once they had floated their goods down the river from whether it was Montgomery or somewhere in Kentucky or who knows, they would then dismantle it and sell it for lumber, right? But with the steamboat, it's going to go up and down the river regardless of the current, and it's going to be able to do it over and over and over again, right? Well, now once you've introduced this new technology here locally in the state, there's a lot of folks aren't going to be delighted about it. If you're the guy that is still floating your, if you've got a load of turkeys or cows or whatever, or hogsheads of tobacco, I don't know if you really would have tobacco in Alabama, but if you're trying to float them down the river to Mobile and somebody's steamboat comes along and plows you over, it's no small question, you want to recover your loss. You want the steamboat owner to pay. If you're the steamboat owner, you want the state, you want the little farmer to pay. So it's actually a very important question, and it's a question of federal versus state. Under the old rule, if you ran over the one guy's raft, if you ran over him, it's his fault. Under the new federal law, though, if the feds are letting you run steamboats up and down rivers, who controls? Now, we know that ultimately federal is going to be supreme here, but it's John Gale, the former governor. He's a Democrat turned Whig. At different times in his career, he was a huge fan of states' rights. At other times in his career, he would take the side of, Andrew Jackson and say the Union forever and inseparable. So it was interesting to watch how he worked it out, and ultimately he goes, no, the steamboat, if you didn't yield, then he's going to let the federal rule stand. Not sexy now, but it would have been very controversial then, and it's the sort of thing they had to do over and over again. You see it by the Civil War. It's even clearer, sort of what's going on, and it gets to the point where a judge will actually flout the U.S. Constitution. It's William Giles Jones. He is asked to hear cases having to do with contraband slaves. As of 1808, it is unconstitutional to import slaves into the United States. Now, Judge Crawford, earlier in the century, had such a case, and he goes, no, these have been smuggled in through the panhandle of Florida. This is illegal. No, that's the end of it. Jones decided that it was okay, right? So it's a good example of, you'll see someone, that's close to, it's not quite Bastide level, because Giles Jones wasn't actually the one selling the slaves, but it's an example of a judge coming up against a federal rule. He didn't like it, so he just ignored it. Interesting twist on that is that he'll be overruled by John Archibald Campbell, who was brought down as a Supreme Court justice sitting on circuit. And he has the famous example of, what Judge Jones had said was, we can't tell if these are foreign slaves or not. And as Justice Campbell noted, you could just ask them, that sort of thing. I think his line is, the African is a rational being and can tell you where he came from. Or you could just talk to him, and if he has a foreign accent, he's probably not from the United States. How am I doing on time, Debbie? Still got 10 minutes. I'm going to speed up then. I'm speeding up because I wanted my segue here, since they've given me a microphone and I have 2 books, we're going to find a way to make these things fit together. And it's actually not that hard to do, because here it is, this book, the orange book, that I fooled with down here in this very archive for so many years. The most important decision of the disfranchisement era is the case of Giles versus Harris that came out of the U.S. District Court here in Montgomery. I've spoken here before, and I've recognized some of you from when I spoke here a few years ago. I'm not going to tell you all the minutiae of Giles versus Harris, because A, you may have heard it, and B, then you wouldn't possibly buy the book, and that's no good. So what I'm going to look at here is I want to talk more about who is behind the case. There's the name on the case, Jackson W. Giles, but he's not by himself. Some of you, there are some details of the case have come out previously, not at any great length. There's Jackson Giles, who some folks know worked for the post office in Montgomery, but they don't really get what the connection there would be to the U.S. District Court. The United States District Court, until the courthouse, the old federal courthouse is built, is housed for much of the late 19th century in a building that in Montgomery was just called the post office. Right? It's a great big red brick Queen Anne Victorian-style building farther down the hill on Dexter Avenue that's now obviously gone. Beautiful building. In most cities where there was a U.S. District Court, that's how it's going to work. Because again, the federal presence in the states is so light up until really well into the 20th century that is where all federal installations are going to be housed. Everybody pretty much is going to work out of a post office building. Or if you're in a port city like New Orleans or Mobile, you might work out of a customs house. So when we say that Jackson Giles worked for the post office, you need to understand he works in the building with the United States District Court. Now, Jackson Giles himself does work for the post office. Sorry, not to ruin my story here, but the guys that will join with him and make league to fight the Constitution, they're actually, some of them are clerks there in the federal building, some of them are janitors, some of them are mail carriers like Jackson Giles, but they, in purposes of today's talk, they represent all of the people who make the court go. Right? And there's a lot more people making the court go today than would have made the court go in the 19th century. But I think it might be good just to remember, there is support staff. There are clerks. There's the clerk, and then there's the law clerks, and there are the judges, and there are the secretaries, and there are the marshals in the building, and then there are the various staffers that keep the place in running order. And so that's who I would like to look at in my last few minutes here, talking about the case of Giles versus Harris. Now, the case of Giles versus Harris, in a nutshell, is a challenge to Alabama's 1901 Constitution. So it is the most prominent challenge to the state constitution, but it's also the most important such case of that entire period. It's more important, honestly, in my opinion, than Plessy versus Ferguson. I know Plessy is the one that makes it into the school books now, but Giles is actually a bigger deal at the time. Sort of to set up this little short passage that I'm going to read for you here. Voter registration began in March of 1902. And the lawyer who was going to be representing these guys, even though these guys didn't know that there was already a lawyer waiting to represent them, it's important that they file this case before too long has passed. For example, if they filed it, there's a state election in 1902. There are congressional elections, but state elections are going to be held that summer. And it's important that they have this thing in the works before anyone elected under that Constitution takes office. Because in previous cases, the Supreme Court has said, well, it's moot. End of story. All right? So they've got to rush. And so the spring of 1902 is a very perilous time for black Alabamians and, well, a whole lot of white Alabamians, too, as they try to get registered. The Constitution had disfranchised everybody, in fact. Right? So everyone in the state lost their vote and had to re-register. So it's going to be a very busy time. All right. As registration continued, in county after county, registrars boasted of how few blacks had received or would receive those coveted voting registration certificates. March 27th was a, quote, day dedicated to Negroes for Calhoun County's registrars, the Montgomery Advertiser reported. 100 applied for registration in the city of Anniston, and the Calhoun registrars congratulated themselves for turning away 83. Sumter County, a black majority county in the western Black Belt, began registration on March the 17th, and at Cuba, 103 whites and 2 blacks registered. At York, there were 73 whites and 1 black man enrolled. And at Livingston, 135 white men received life certificates, as did 7 African Americans. Farther east, 2,400 men had registered in the city of Montgomery by late April. Few of those were black, and those African Americans who succeeded did so, apparently, via the infamous Descendants Clause as Spanish American War veterans. At least 2 counties, Crenshaw and Lee, boasted that they had registered no blacks through the end of June. The disfranchisement plan's success both pleased and alarmed white Alabamians, the registrars included. They were pleased that few blacks had registered, but mildly perturbed that relatively few white men were paying the poll tax and claiming their lifetime certificates. By late June, an estimated 2,000 Montgomery County whites had not tried to register. The county's registrars, Charles Teasley, Jeff Harris, and William Gunter, Jr., hoped that, quote, the indifferent electors will come forward and attend to this important duty. Lest white men fear derision due to poverty or illiteracy, Teasley, Harris, and Gunter wanted it known, this is through newspaper interviews, wanted it known that they were, quote, anxious to issue certificates to the white voters of the county. Registrars and Democratic Party officials were genuinely and deeply concerned with the lower than expected registration. Unless something changed by July, more white voters than the disfranchisers had intended would fall away. With a statewide election looming, a gubernatorial election no less, the Sumter County Sun warned whites that they must register and soon, quote, it behooves every white man in Sumter to get his name on the list before July the 31st. The registrars and the county Democratic committees knew the name of every prospective white voter, and at intercourse, that's its real name, York and Cuba, the Sun complained over 100 white men had not registered. The only humane part of this process was that the registrars made a circuit through their county precincts rather than demand that voters always come to them. The registrars were paid for their trouble, of course, and spent most of their days at the county courthouse, but the 1901 Constitution, despite the disfranchisers' best efforts, had provided for a few brief moments of democracy in Alabama. African Americans always showed up when the registrars made precinct visits. Black federal employees in at least 3 counties were especially troublesome. Postmasterships, other postal jobs, and federal patronage positions, like jobs at the courthouse, were filled by Republicans, and in the white Democratic South, U.S. Office buildings often stood as little islands of Republican Party politics, and were the only places where white Southerners might expect to encounter a black official. In Tallapoosa County, Alexander City's postmaster, Joseph Manning, led a small-scale protest against the local registration board. There, the colored school principal repeatedly tried but never could make his application. The board had decided to hide from the principal whenever he showed up and all other black applicants rather than face them personally, because that could be unpleasant. When Manning learned of this, he sprang into action. The white populist legislator turned Republican activist was incensed, according to his biographer. Along with a delegation of prospective black voters, he marched on the county's elections registrars. They found success. 20 or so black men got their lifetime certificates. It was an obscenely low total, but better than none. The same sad stories played out over and over that spring and summer, and the most significant of them described a group of black post office building clerks and janitors, all of whom worked in Montgomery's post office building. The Montgomery post office workers' unsuccessful registration attempt set the stage for an intricate and daring legal assault against disfranchisement. Their number included James Jeter, Edward Dale, and the man who emerged as their leader, Jackson W. Giles. Jackson Giles was born a slave in 1859. He worked as a cotton sampler in his 20s, and by his early 40s, he had won a coveted job at the post office building as a clerk and mail carrier. He's a widowed father of 3 in 1902. He lived on Watt Street with his second wife, Mary, who was 16 years his junior. In Montgomery, on March the 13th, 1902, Giles, age 43, appeared before Teasley, Harris, and Gunter. Giles had lived in Montgomery from his infancy, had kept his poll taxes current, and did not suffer for many of the character disqualifications prescribed by the 1901 Constitution. He was exactly the type of African American whom the disfranchisers claimed no animus toward during the Constitutional Convention, but he was also the man that they most feared. Self-possessed, independent-minded, a black belt denizen, and a Republican, he and any others like him could make trouble for Democrats on Election Day. Thus, he had to go. So they targeted him and others like him. They ought not to have, but they did. It was important that Alabama blacks file any court challenges before the March registration ended and before the next federal election, and Giles and his friends responded with alacrity. Joining fellow post office building employees Jeter and Dale were J.W. Adams, a Montgomery dry goods dealer and Booker T. Washington's confidant, and Derry Fonville, a Union veteran whom Montgomery County registrars had turned away. I thought she was coming to give me the hook. These men, along with dozens more who were not identified by name in news accounts, established the Colored Men Suffrage Association of Alabama, or the CMS DoubleA, and chose Giles as president. They held their first meeting at Dorset's Hall, which I believe still stands, on March the 25th, 1902, 12 days after the registrars refused to register Giles, and raised $200 at that first meeting. There was only one thing, really, on Giles's agenda: litigation. Yet litigation was going to be expensive. The CMS DoubleA immediately issued an appeal to black Alabamians aimed at collecting at least $2,000 to fund their case. This is in 1902. The African-American Savannah Tribune was glad to hear the news from Montgomery, but guarded. It is hoped, the paper observed, that this movement will not be spasmodic, but that there will be a well-defined plan, and it will be adhered to until the result is attained. Jackson Giles did his level best to satisfy the Tribune's wish. No actual copy of that circular survives, the one that they had issued after that first meeting. But the text has survived, however, because the Montgomery Journal, the afternoon paper here in Montgomery, intercepted a copy and printed it verbatim, along with Giles' accompanying cover letter on its front page. Giles and the CMS DoubleA secretary, a man named J.S. Julian, invited any man, quote, interested in your own political rights and the rights of your people to join them in a, quote, struggle to restore our lost citizenship wrested from us by the unjust operation of the new Constitution of the state of Alabama. They wanted recipients to contribute to their test case and wanted the circulars distributed among your people. The character test and descendants clause were the primary targets of, quote, an appeal to the colored citizens of Alabama. And I'll actually stop there. That's actually the name of the chapter. And am I at time? And she says I'm at time. Thank you.
Thank you. Riser has a few minutes to take questions from the audience. Be sure to take the microphone, raise your hand, let us know if you want to ask a question, and speak directly into the microphone. Also, you have a special treat. Dr. Riser's books are available for sale in the lobby, and at the conclusion of our program, the University of Alabama School of Law sends complimentary copies of A Goodly Heritage for each one attending today. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we will get you the microphone. Do I see one in the back?
I have been researching a case that occurred here in Montgomery in the 1850s in the Middle District U.S. courts. A suit was filed against the postmaster here and 2 other citizens of Montgomery. The case was delayed 1857, 58, 59, carried over year after year, and then there's nothing. Does anybody know what might have happened to the case books of the U.S. Middle District from 1860 to 1860? Well, of course, 1860 is the one I'm primarily interested in.
Well, you know what was going on then, right?
I know what was going on. Yes, I do know what was going on.
Hey, never hurts. I know where they are. If they exist, they are over in, well, it's called the Atlanta Regional Facility of the National Archives.
I've been there. It doesn't exist.
Well, Fort Worth has the Fifth Circuit, but they've taken them, if it's a Fifth Circuit case that came out of Alabama, Georgia, or Florida, those are over in Atlanta. Not all. See?
The archives here actually have some of those.
See, you're in the right place. Everything I ever looked for was in Morrow, so therefore I'm going to say that everything is in Morrow. But one tip that I might give to you, did you ask to look at Confederate dockets?
I've checked around and haven't particularly found anything that would indicate that they were in existence. I just thought maybe you had found them in there somewhere.
No, I have no experience with a Confederate docket out of Montgomery. I know from a friend of mine doing his dissertation, he found the Confederate docket. I'm just going to ignore it. They feel enough shame. I do when this happens in my classes, I make the class stop. And I direct everyone, we are all to stare and point at the person whose phone is ringing, because when we do that, they will not be able to get it turned off if it's vibrating anyway. I have seen the Confederate docket for, well, it would have been the whole state, but out of the court in Huntsville. So some of these things do exist.
Miss Neely?
But they're going to know more than I about their own court.
If you'll call me, I'll go through what we have and see if we can determine
That'd be great. I'll check with you.
Thank you.
My stuff is all easy. It didn't happen during a war, and so.
Do we have another question?
Man. I like how it all waited right for the end.
Can you tell us the outcome of Giles v. Harris?
Oh, the outcome? It's actually, I think he's asking me that because it's not how you think it might have turned out. What happened is there is Thomas Jones had just been put on the bench when this happened. He was appointed as the U.S. District Judge in October of 1901. He was the first major appointment that Teddy Roosevelt made as president. Huge drama attended to his thing. International drama, actually, literally, attended to his appointment as a U.S. District Judge. He has a relationship. It's a somewhat murky relationship, but it's a definite relationship with Booker T. Washington. Washington had had him installed as judge. He told Roosevelt, appoint him. Roosevelt did what Washington said. I told you that there was a lawyer waiting for something to happen in Alabama. It's because Washington had already lined up a lawyer to be on hand for when they found somebody who was willing to be a plaintiff out of Alabama. And so what they do is his name is Wilfred Smith, and they sort of sneak him into the state in the dark of night, and just miraculously, I guess as far as Giles and his friends were concerned, this lawyer just walked in and said, "Hey, I'm here. I've been sent by," he goes, "I've been sent by prominent patrons in the East," and they just assumed it meant like New York. They didn't know East Alabama. So they had, and he was at that point, he's the only black man to have ever won a case in the United States Supreme Court as of 1902. So he just sort of walks in and says, "I would like to represent you," and so they sign him up. Wilfred Smith, Congress had only recently created the United States Courts of Appeals, and there would only be one judge. But they also had worked on federal jurisdiction, and they had created this rule that said that you could kick a case directly to the Supreme Court if the only question involved was jurisdiction. If it was a matter of fact or law, no. It had to be a question of jurisdiction. So when the lawyer cooked up the U.S. District Court case with Giles as the plaintiff and his other friends as the other plaintiffs involved, what he does is he goes to Thomas Jones, and what is laid out for him, and actually the state's lawyers, the Attorney General and William Gunter Sr., there's two Gunners, and I see Dr. Thornton here in the audience, and he's the one who made sure I understood there were two different Gunners, so that's why I keep emphasizing Junior and Senior. William Gunter Sr. was in on it with Wilfred Smith, and apparently it's pretty clear Thomas Jones was in on what they were up to. What they arranged to happen was they arranged for Thomas Jones to find against Jackson Giles. And what they had carefully arranged was Jones dismissed the case on purely jurisdictional grounds, and this was so that they could get an immediate case before the United States Supreme Court. So what has been written about for years is how, it is so terrible. Booker T. Washington went to such trouble to put Jones on the bench, and then, he ruled against him in his secret test case, but you see he didn't. Now, Jones has done a huge favor to Jackson Giles and Wilfred Smith and Booker T. Washington, and indeed potentially all Southern blacks. And he saved his own political skin, remember, because he looks like he has rejected the case. Got to the Supreme Court, and Oliver Wendell Holmes had just been installed as a Supreme Court justice, and Southern blacks foolishly assumed that because Holmes was from Massachusetts, he would necessarily be their friend, right? No. And so the case got in front of Holmes. The court did not have to decide the merits of the case. They could have just said, yes, there's jurisdiction, or no, there is no jurisdiction. But no, Smith invited, and Holmes accepted and waded into it, and you got the particularly disastrous decision of Giles versus Harris, which in the press of the day was described as the second Dred Scott. Right? That's how important people thought of it. They thought it was a second Dred Scott. Right? So it did not turn out well at the national level, but at the district court, it went a whole lot better than a lot of people would have known.
Thank you, Dr. Riser. At this time, Dr. Riser will be going to the table, so if you would like a copy of this book, that we will have them available at the table right over here, and we really appreciate Dr. Riser coming today. Let's give him a round of applause.